Paul always started his mornings the same way. A cup of strong coffee, a quick glance at the news, and a gentle kiss on his daughter Sarah's forehead before heading to work. To the students at Hillcrest High School, he was more than just a literature teacher. His passion for books and storytelling was infectious, making even the most reluctant readers fall in love with the written word. His classroom was a haven, filled with the scent of old books and the quiet hum of eager minds at work. Every afternoon, after the final bell rang, Paul would head home to his loving wife, Susan. Their evenings were filled with laughter and stories about their day. Susan, with her sharp mind and relentless curiosity as an investigative journalist, would share her latest findings, often leaving Paul both proud and slightly uneasy. He admired her tenacity, but it also reminded him of the secrets he kept hidden. Their life together seemed picture-perfect. Weekends were spent at the park, with Sarah's giggles filling the air as she played on the swings. Neighbors admired Paul for his dedication to his family and his students, often referring to him as the ideal husband and father. Little did they know, behind Paul's warm smile and gentle demeanor lay a man with a past he hoped would never resurface. Behind the mask of Paul, the devoted teacher and loving father, lay the shadows of a man named Mark. Years ago, Mark was a different person. Ruthless, calculating, and deeply embedded in a world of crime. He was a trusted member of a powerful criminal organization, a life filled with danger, deceit, and betrayal. Mark's days were spent plotting, negotiating, and often eliminating threats to his group's interests. Nights were no different, cloaked in secrecy and whispered conversations. He had a mentor, Vincent, who was more like a father to him, guiding him through the treacherous waters of their underworld life. But everything changed one fateful night. A deal gone wrong, a burst of gunfire, and Vincent lay dying in Mark's arms. In his mentor's last breaths, he urged Mark to escape this life, to find a way out before it consumed him completely. That moment shattered Mark's world. The death of his mentor was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the fragile line between life and death in their world. Determined to honor Vincent's final wish, Mark made a decision that night. He would disappear, leave everything behind, and start anew. With the help of a loyal friend, he forged a new identity, meticulously erasing all traces of his former self. Mark ceased to exist, and Paul was born, stepping into a life that promised safety and redemption. This new life wasn't just an escape. It was a chance at redemption. A chance to be the man he always wanted to be but never had the courage to become. But deep down, Mark knew that no matter how far he ran or how well he hid, the past had a way of catching up with him. And as Paul, he lived each day with the hope that his secret would remain buried forever. The night was supposed to be routine, a simple exchange, a deal they had done countless times before. Mark and Vincent arrived at the deserted warehouse, the air thick with tension. As they waited, the silence was broken only by the distant hum of city life and the occasional rustle of rodents scurrying in the shadows. The deal went south quickly. In a matter of seconds, the warehouse erupted in chaos. Gunfire echoed off the cold concrete walls, flashes of light piercing through the darkness. Mark, ever sharp and vigilant, dodged bullets and returned fire, his instincts in overdrive. But amidst the confusion, he heard a sound that froze his blood. A sharp, pained gasp from Vincent. He turned to see his mentor, his guide through the treacherous life of crime, clutching his chest, blood seeping through his fingers. Mark's heart pounded as he rushed to Vincent's side, the world around him fading into a blur. He cradled Vincent, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. Vincent's eyes, once so full of life and cunning, now held a haunting clarity. "Mark," he whispered, his voice weak but urgent. "This life, it leads nowhere. Leave, start over. Promise me." Tears blurred Mark's vision as he nodded, the weight of the promise settling heavily on his shoulders. He watched helplessly as the light faded from Vincent's eyes. A man who had been his father in every way that mattered, now gone. The realization hit him like a freight train. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Mark knew he couldn't stay. The life he had built with Vincent was over. In that moment, Cradling his dying mentor, he made the hardest decision of his life. He would vanish, leave behind the only world he had ever known. He would honor Vincent's last wish, no matter the cost. With a final, grief-stricken glance at Vincent's lifeless body, Mark fled into the night, his heart heavy with loss and resolve. He disappeared into the shadows, knowing that he would never be the same again. Mark's disappearance was meticulous and calculated. He knew that to truly vanish, he had to erase every trace of his existence. With the help of his loyal friend, Jake, who owed Vincent a favor, Mark began the arduous process of shedding his old identity and crafting a new one. Jake was an expert in the art of reinvention. He provided Mark with a new set of documents, a birth certificate, a social security number, and a driver's license, all under the name Paul Anderson. They carefully constructed Paul's backstory. A quiet man who grew up in a small town, moved away for college, and eventually settled in a new city to pursue a career in teaching. It was a story so mundane, so perfectly ordinary, that no one would ever suspect its fabrication. Mark embraced his new persona with a fervor born of desperation. He cut ties with anyone from his past life, disappearing without a trace. He studied educational theories, literature, and pedagogy, immersing himself in the world of academia. He took night classes and earned a degree, his determination fueled by the promise he made to Vincent. Paul Anderson emerged from the shadows as a dedicated and knowledgeable literature teacher. He moved to a distant city, far from the reach of his past, and applied for a teaching position at Hillcrest High School. His charm and genuine passion for education quickly won over the school board, and he was hired without hesitation. Paul's new life began to take shape. He found a modest apartment, filled it with second-hand furniture, and started to build a life of quiet normalcy. The transformation was almost complete, but it wasn't until he met Susan that Paul truly felt he had left Mark behind. Susan was everything he had never allowed himself to hope for: intelligent, kind, and fiercely independent. Their courtship was a whirlwind, filled with laughter and shared dreams. Paul was cautious at first, terrified that his past would somehow seep through the cracks of his new identity. But Susan's love and trust gave him the strength to bury Mark even deeper. They married in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by new friends who knew nothing of Paul's previous life. With Susan by his side, Paul felt a sense of peace he had never known. They soon welcomed their daughter, Sarah, into the world, and Paul was determined to give her the life he had never had, a life free from fear and violence. Paul Anderson, once Mark, had finally found the redemption he so desperately sought. Yet, deep down, he knew that the shadows of his past lingered, always threatening to resurface. For now, though, he embraced his new identity, hoping against hope that it would be enough to keep his past buried forever. Years had passed since Mark had become Paul, and his new life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. One evening, as Paul sat grading papers at his kitchen table, the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone, but he answered it to find Jake standing there, looking older and more worn than Paul remembered. "Jake," Paul said, his heart skipping a beat. "What are you doing here?" Jake stepped inside, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "We need to talk," he said, his voice hushed. "It's about your past." Paul's stomach churned. He had tried so hard to leave that life behind, and now here was a piece of it standing in his living room. He led Jake to the kitchen, where they sat at the table covered in student essays and coffee rings. "What's going on?" Paul asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jake looked him in the eyes. "There have been whispers, Paul. People from the old life are sniffing around, asking questions. I thought you should know." Paul felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "I left that life, Jake. I have a family now. I can't go back." "I know," Jake said, leaning forward. "But you need to be careful. They're looking for something, or someone. You might be safer, but you need to stay alert." Paul nodded, the weight of his past crashing down on him again. "Thanks for the warning, Jake. I'll be careful." Jake left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Paul alone with his thoughts. The shadows of his past were closer than ever, and he knew he couldn't ignore them. But for now, he had a family to protect, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. That night, as Paul lay in bed next to Susan, listening to the rhythmic sound of her breathing, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had built a life on a foundation of lies, and now those lies were threatening to crumble. But he couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not ever. The next day, Paul was back at Hillcrest High School, his mind racing with thoughts of Jake's visit. But as soon as he stepped into his classroom, he put on his usual warm smile. His students needed him, and for them, he would be the best version of himself. Paul Anderson, the dedicated teacher, loving husband, and doting father. As he lectured about the themes of redemption in classic literature, he couldn't help but reflect on his own quest for redemption. Every day was a step away from his past, but it was also a reminder of how fragile his new life was. And as he looked out at the faces of his students, he vowed to protect that life, no matter the cost. Susan Anderson was relentless when it came to uncovering the truth. As a seasoned investigative journalist, she had a nose for stories that mattered, and she wasn't afraid to dig deep to find the answers. Her latest assignment was no different. A series of unsolved crimes that had stumped the authorities for years. She pored over old case files, interviewed witnesses, and followed every lead with unwavering determination. Paul admired Susan's dedication, even as it made him uneasy. He knew how dangerous her work could be, and he couldn't shake the fear that her investigation might somehow intersect with his buried past. But Susan was careful, methodical, and always seemed to find her way out of trouble. One evening, Susan came home with a look of excitement in her eyes. "Paul, you won't believe what I found today," she said, dropping her bag on the kitchen counter and pulling out a folder stuffed with papers. Paul looked up from the book he was reading, masking his anxiety with a smile. "What is it this time, Sherlock?" Susan laughed, a sound that always warmed his heart. "I found a connection between some of the unsolved cases. It all points back to an old criminal organization that used to operate in this area." Paul's heart skipped a beat. He forced himself to stay calm. "An old criminal organization? Sounds dangerous." "It is," Susan said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. "But it's also fascinating. These guys were involved in everything: drug trafficking, extortion, even a few murders. And get this, they just vanished about 10 years ago. No one knows why." Paul's mind raced. He knew exactly why they vanished, but he couldn't tell Susan that. "That sounds like a tough case to crack," he said carefully. Susan nodded. "It's the biggest challenge I've faced in a while, but I think I'm onto something. If I can figure out what happened to these guys, it could be the story of a lifetime." Paul felt a chill run down his spine. Susan was getting too close, and he didn't know how to steer her away without raising suspicion. "Just promise me you'll be careful," he said, his voice tinged with genuine concern. "Always," she replied, leaning in to kiss him. "But you know me. I won't stop until I get to the bottom of this." Paul watched as Susan disappeared into her office, her mind already consumed with the details of her investigation. He sat alone in the kitchen, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. He had built a new life, a good life, and he couldn't let it be destroyed. But how could he protect his family from a truth that was clawing its way to the surface? As the night wore on, Paul made a silent vow. He would find a way to keep Susan safe, even if it meant confronting the ghosts of his past. Because some secrets were too dangerous to stay hidden forever, and the woman he loved was walking straight into the heart of one. Susan's investigation picked up speed as she followed the trail of clues that seemed to lead her deeper into the heart of the old criminal organization. Every piece of evidence she uncovered added another layer to the mystery, drawing her closer to a truth that had been buried for years. Late one night, Susan was in her home office, surrounded by stacks of papers and glowing computer screens. Her eyes were tired, but her mind was sharp, piecing together the puzzle before her. She had found a name that seemed to be at the center of everything. Mark. She didn't know who Mark was, but she was determined to find out. As she cross-referenced old police reports, newspaper articles, and confidential sources, a picture began to emerge. Mark was more than just a name. He was a ghost, someone who had once been deeply entwined with the criminal underworld but had vanished without a trace. Paul, meanwhile, watched Susan's progress with growing unease. He could see how close she was getting, and it terrified him. He tried to divert her attention, suggesting other stories, other leads, but Susan's journalistic instincts were too strong. She was on a mission, and nothing could deter her. One evening, as Susan was poring over a particularly revealing document, Paul decided to take a more direct approach. He walked into her office, his heart pounding, and sat down across from her. "Hey, Sue," he said, trying to sound casual. "You've been working so hard on this case. Don't you think it's time to take a break?" Susan looked up, surprised by his suggestion. "A break? Paul, I'm so close to something big. I can feel it." "I know," Paul said gently, "but you're wearing yourself out. Come on, let's take a night off. We can watch a movie, spend some time together. The case will still be here tomorrow." Susan hesitated, the determination in her eyes wavering for a moment. "I suppose I could use a break," she admitted. "Just for tonight." Paul felt a wave of relief wash over him. He smiled and stood up, extending his hand to her. "Come on, let's leave all this for now." As they settled on the couch, a movie playing in the background, Paul couldn't shake the fear gnawing at him. He knew that Susan's investigation was a ticking time bomb, one that could explode at any moment and shatter the life they had built together. But for now, he held her close, savoring the quiet moments of normalcy. He knew he couldn't keep her in the dark forever, but tonight, he just wanted to be with his wife, to feel the warmth of her presence and forget about the storm that was brewing on the horizon. As days turned into weeks, Susan's investigation became an all-consuming obsession. She was getting closer to the truth, and Paul could feel the noose tightening around his neck. Each new discovery she made brought her one step nearer to uncovering his past. Paul's anxiety grew with every passing day, but he continued to play the role of the supportive husband, all the while trying to steer her away from the dangerous path she was on. One evening, as Susan was meticulously analyzing her latest findings, she stumbled upon a set of records that sent a chill down her spine. They were old bank statements, wire transfers, and coded messages, transactions that pointed directly to the old criminal organization she had been tracking. And there it was again, the name Mark, appearing repeatedly in connection with the most significant activities of the group. Susan's mind raced as she pieced together the puzzle. She had a gut feeling that Mark was not just another member but someone crucial, possibly even the key to understanding the entire network. She knew she had to find out more about him, but the deeper she delved, the more elusive he became. Every lead she followed seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving her with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Paul was growing increasingly desperate. He could see the determination in Susan's eyes, and he knew it was only a matter of time before she connected the dots. One night, as he was putting Sarah to bed, he heard Susan's voice, tense and excited, calling him from her office. "Paul, come here. You need to see this," she said, her tone urgent. Paul walked into her office, his heart pounding in his chest. Susan pointed at the computer screen, her eyes wide with revelation. "I think I've found a breakthrough. These transactions, they're connected to a man named Mark. He was heavily involved in the organization, and then he just disappeared. But look at this," she said, pulling up an old photograph. "This picture was taken at one of their gatherings. It's blurry, but I think I can make out his face." Paul's blood ran cold as he looked at the grainy image. It was an old photograph, taken long before he became Paul Anderson. He recognized the face immediately, even though it was barely visible. It was him, Mark. "Do you see it?" Susan asked, not noticing Paul's reaction. "If I can find out who Mark is, I might be able to crack this whole case wide open." Paul swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "Susan, maybe you should slow down. This guy sounds dangerous. You don't want to put yourself or our family at risk." Susan looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "I know it's risky, Paul, but this is important. These people need to be brought to justice, and if I can help do that, I have to try." Paul nodded, the weight of his secret pressing down on him more heavily than ever. "Just promise me you'll be careful," he said quietly. "I promise," Susan replied, giving him a reassuring smile. As Paul left the office, he felt a surge of panic. Susan was getting too close, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep the truth from her. He needed to find a way to protect her, to shield her from the dangers of his past. But with every step she took, the walls were closing in, and Paul knew that the time for hiding was running out. Paul was losing sleep. Night after night, he lay awake, haunted by the fear that his carefully constructed life was about to crumble. Susan's investigation was relentless, and every new piece of evidence she uncovered brought her closer to discovering his true identity. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, of shattering the trust and love they had built. But he also knew he couldn't keep running from his past forever. One evening, after putting Sarah to bed, Paul found himself standing in the doorway of Susan's office. She was engrossed in her work, papers spread out across the desk, her laptop screen glowing with lines of text and images. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, knowing that he needed to confront his own fears. "Susan, we need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Susan looked up, concern flickering in her eyes. "Paul, what's wrong?" He sat down across from her, struggling to find the right words. "It's about your investigation. I can't shake the feeling that you're getting too close to something dangerous." Susan's expression softened. "I know you're worried, but I can handle this. I've dealt with dangerous people before." Paul shook his head, his heart aching with the weight of his secret. "It's different this time. You don't understand just how dangerous these people are." Susan reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Paul, I trust you. If you think there's something I should know, please tell me." He looked into her eyes, the words catching in his throat. He wanted to tell her everything, to finally lay bare the truth that had been eating away at him. But the fear of losing her, of losing everything they had built together, held him back. Instead, he squeezed her hand and forced a smile. "Just promise me you'll be careful. I can't bear the thought of anything happening to you." "I promise," she said, her eyes filled with unwavering determination. "But you have to trust me too. Let me do my job." Paul nodded, the conflict tearing at his soul. He wanted to trust her, to believe that she could handle whatever came her way. But he knew that the truth was far more complicated and dangerous than she realized. As he left her office, he felt the weight of his dilemma pressing down on him more heavily than ever. Days turned into weeks, and Susan's investigation continued to make progress. Paul watched her from the sidelines, his anxiety growing with each new discovery she made. He could see the pieces of the puzzle coming together, forming a picture that was all too familiar. And with every step she took, he felt the walls closing in, trapping him in a web of his own making. One night, as Susan worked late into the evening, Paul found himself standing in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection of a man he barely recognized. He had become someone else entirely, a man torn between the life he had built and the past he couldn't escape. The weight of his secret was suffocating, and he knew that he couldn't keep it hidden forever. As he looked into his own eyes, he made a decision. It was time to face the truth, to confront the past he had tried so hard to bury. For the sake of his family, for the sake of the woman he loved, he had to find a way to reconcile his two identities. He had to become whole again, no matter the cost. Paul's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of his situation. The walls of his carefully constructed life were closing in, and he knew he had to take action to protect his family. His first priority was Sarah. She was the light of his life, an innocent child who knew nothing of her father's dark past. That weekend, Paul decided to take Sarah to the park, a place where she could laugh and play, and he could watch over her with a protective eye. As they walked hand in hand, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Sarah deserved a father who was free from shadows, a father who didn't carry the burden of a hidden identity. "Look, Daddy, the swings," Sarah exclaimed, her face lighting up with pure joy. Paul smiled, pushing his worries aside for the moment. "All right, sweetheart, let's go to the swings." As Sarah played, Paul kept a vigilant watch, his mind racing with thoughts of how to keep her safe. He knew he couldn't let his guard down, not even for a second. The thought of anyone from his past coming near his daughter was unbearable. Later that evening, after Sarah had fallen asleep, Paul sat down with Susan in the living room. He had been avoiding this conversation, but he knew it was time. He needed to find a way to communicate his fears without revealing too much. "Susan, we need to talk about Sarah," he began, his voice steady but firm. Susan looked up, concern in her eyes. "What is it, Paul?" "I think we need to be more cautious," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I've been feeling uneasy lately, and I just want to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep her safe." Susan frowned. "Is this about my investigation?" "Paul, I promise I'm being careful." "It's not just that," Paul said, his heart aching with the weight of his hidden truth. "I just have a bad feeling, and I can't shake it. Please, just trust me on this." Susan reached out and took his hand, her touch a source of comfort. "Of course I trust you. If you think we need to be more cautious, then we will be. But Paul, you need to tell me if there's something you're not saying." Paul looked into her eyes, the love and trust there almost too much to bear. He wanted to tell her everything, but he knew that revealing his past could put them all in even greater danger. Instead, he nodded, squeezing her hand. "Thank you. I just want to make sure we're prepared for anything." As Susan went to bed, Paul stayed up, his mind racing with thoughts of how to protect his family. He knew that the only way to keep them safe was to confront his past head-on. But for now, he would take it one step at a time, doing everything in his power to ensure Sarah's safety. The next day, Paul took additional precautions. He made sure all the doors and windows were secure, installed a new security system, and even considered moving to a different neighborhood. He knew these measures were temporary fixes, but they gave him a sense of control, a way to protect his family in the immediate future. As he tucked Sarah into bed that night, she looked up at him with innocent eyes. "Daddy, are we safe?" Paul forced a smile, his heart breaking. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe. And I promise I'll always keep you safe." But as he walked out of her room, he knew that promise was getting harder to keep. The shadows of his past were closing in, and he could only hope that he would find a way to protect his family before it was too late. Susan's investigation had reached a fever pitch. Every lead she followed seemed to bring her closer to the elusive figure known as Mark. Late one night, as she sifted through a mountain of documents, she stumbled upon a breakthrough. A series of coded messages exchanged between members of the old criminal organization. These messages hinted at an intricate network of operations, and at the center of it all was Mark. She had managed to decrypt part of the code, revealing a pattern of bank transactions that led to a series of safe houses scattered across the city. These locations were used by the organization for meetings, exchanges, and as hideouts when things got too hot. One address, in particular, caught Susan's eye. It was in a part of town known for its abandoned warehouses, a perfect place for clandestine activities. Determined to uncover the truth, Susan decided to visit the location the next day. She packed her camera, notebook, and a small recorder, ready to document anything she found. As she prepared, Paul watched her with growing anxiety. He could see the determination in her eyes, the same determination that had driven her to uncover countless stories in the past. But this time, the stakes were higher, and the danger was too close to home. "Susan, please be careful," Paul said, his voice thick with concern. "You don't know what you might find there." "I will, Paul," she assured him, her tone resolute. "But I have to see this through. It's too important to ignore." The next day, Susan drove to the address she had uncovered. The warehouse was old and decrepit, its windows boarded up, and its exterior covered in graffiti. She parked her car a few blocks away and approached cautiously, her senses on high alert. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the boards, casting eerie shadows on the floor. Susan moved quietly, her camera ready, her eyes scanning for any sign of activity. As she ventured deeper into the building, she found remnants of the past. Old crates, discarded papers, and broken furniture. But then, she saw something that made her heart race. a hidden door, slightly ajar. She pushed it open, revealing a small room filled with filing cabinets and boxes. Carefully, she began to search through the contents, her excitement growing with each new discovery. There were old ledgers, photographs, and documents detailing the operations of the organization. And then she found it, a folder labeled Mark. With trembling hands, Susan opened the folder. Inside were detailed records of Mark's activities, his role in the organization, and his eventual disappearance. There were photos of him at various meetings, his face clearly visible. As she studied the images, a chill ran down her spine. She recognized the man in the photographs. It was Paul. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The coded messages, the bank transactions, the mysterious Mark. It all pointed to her husband. Her mind raced as she struggled to process the revelation. How could Paul, the man she loved and trusted, be the same person she had been investigating? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. Susan's world felt like it was spinning out of control. She needed to confront Paul, to understand why he had kept this from her, and what it meant for their future. She packed up the documents, her heart heavy with a mix of fear, anger, and confusion. As she drove home, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. When she walked through the door, Paul was waiting for her. He could see the turmoil in her eyes and knew that the moment he had dreaded had finally arrived. "Susan," he began, his voice filled with a mix of resignation and sorrow. "We need to talk." Susan looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Paul, we do." Susan's heart pounded as she stood in the living room, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her. Paul, the man she had loved and trusted for so many years, was not who he claimed to be. The photos, the documents, everything pointed to one undeniable truth. Paul was Mark, a key figure in the criminal organization she had been investigating. "How long were you planning to keep this from me?" Susan demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and betrayal. Paul's eyes were filled with sorrow as he took a step toward her. "Susan, please, let me explain." "Explain? Explain what, Paul?" she snapped. "That you've been lying to me our entire marriage? That you're actually a criminal?" Paul's shoulders slumped, the weight of his past bearing down on him. "Yes, I lied. My name is Mark, and I was part of that organization. But I left that life behind, Susan. I left it all behind to start over, to become someone better." Susan shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "How can I believe you? Everything I thought I knew about you is a lie." Paul's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke. "I never meant to hurt you or Sarah. I wanted to protect you from that part of my life. When Vincent died, I knew I had to get out. I created a new identity and moved as far away as I could. Meeting you, building a life with you, it's the best thing that's ever happened to me." Susan's anger began to give way to confusion and hurt. "Why didn't you tell me? Why keep it a secret for so long?" "Because I was afraid," Paul admitted. "Afraid that if you knew the truth, you would leave me. Afraid that my past would catch up with us and put you and Sarah in danger." Susan's mind raced with questions, but one stood out above the rest. "What happens now, Paul? What do we do?" Paul took a deep breath, his eyes locked onto hers. "We face this together. I will do whatever it takes to keep you and Sarah safe. If that means turning myself in, then that's what I'll do. But I need you to understand that I am not that man anymore. I am Paul Anderson, your husband, and I love you more than anything." Susan felt a wave of conflicting emotions: betrayal, love, fear, and a glimmer of hope. She could see the sincerity in Paul's eyes, the desperation to make things right. She took a step closer to him, her voice softer but still laced with pain. "I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again," she said quietly, "but I need to know that you are truly committed to making this right." Paul nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I am, Susan. I'll do whatever it takes to prove it to you." As they stood there, the enormity of the situation settled over them. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainties. But for the first time, Paul felt a sense of relief. The truth was out, and now they could begin to face it together. Susan took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. Then let's start by figuring out our next steps. We need a plan, and we need to protect Sarah. Paul agreed, his heart filled with a mix of fear and hope. We'll get through this, Susan. I promise. As they sat down to discuss their next moves, the bond between them, though shaken, began to mend. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to face the future together, no matter what it held. The sun had barely risen when Paul's old friend Jake arrived at their doorstep. Susan was wary but trusted Paul's judgment in bringing him into their plan. Jake, looking grimmer and more world-weary than ever, stepped inside, immediately sensing the tension that filled the house. "Jake," Paul began, his voice steady but urgent. "We need your help. Susan knows everything." Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. "I figured this day might come. What do you need from me?" Susan watched as Paul and Jake exchanged a silent understanding, their bond forged in a world she had only just glimpsed. It was clear that despite everything, they trusted each other implicitly. Paul explained the situation, the imminent danger they faced, and the need to protect their family. Jake sat down at the kitchen table, his eyes flickering to Susan and then back to Paul. "All right, first things first, we need to assess the immediate threat. Are there any signs that anyone is closing in on you?" Paul shook his head. "Not yet, but with Susan's investigation getting as close as it did, it's only a matter of time." Jake leaned back, thinking, "We need to cover our tracks, make it look like you've disappeared again. But this time we do it right. No loose ends." Susan, still grappling with the new reality, spoke up. "What about Sarah? How do we keep her safe through all of this?" Jake's gaze softened slightly. "We'll have to be smart about it. Paul, you'll need to stay out of sight for a while. Let Susan and Sarah maintain their normal routines as much as possible. I'll help you find a safe place to lay low." Paul glanced at Susan, his heart heavy with the burden of what he was about to ask of her. "Susan, I need you to trust Jake. He's the only one who can help us right now." Susan nodded, her resolve hardening. "I trust you, Paul. And if you trust Jake, then I do too." Jake outlined a plan to throw any potential pursuers off their trail. He suggested they create false leads, making it appear as though Paul had fled to a different part of the country. They would stage small incidents to leave clues, misleading anyone who might come looking. Over the next few days, Susan and Paul worked together to implement the plan. They packed essential items, ensuring they left nothing behind that could tie Paul to their current location. Jake used his connections to arrange a safe house, a place where Paul could stay hidden until they figured out their next move. The hardest part was saying goodbye. Paul held Sarah tightly, his heart breaking as he looked into her innocent eyes. "Daddy has to go away for a little while, sweetheart, but I promise I'll be back. You be good for Mommy, okay?" Sarah nodded, sensing the seriousness in her father's voice. "Okay, Daddy. I love you." "I love you too, Sarah," Paul whispered, kissing her forehead. As he turned to Susan, the weight of their situation pressed down on him. "I hate that it's come to this, but we'll get through it. I promise." Susan embraced him, her voice choked with emotion. "Just come back to us, Paul. That's all I ask." With one final, lingering look at his family, Paul left with Jake, disappearing into the shadows once more. Susan watched them go, a storm of emotions raging inside her. She knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but she was determined to protect their daughter and hold on to the hope that one day, their family would be whole again. As the days turned into weeks, Susan and Sarah tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Susan continued her work, her resolve strengthened by the need to protect her family. She knew that Paul was out there, somewhere, doing everything he could to keep them safe, and that gave her the strength to face whatever came next. Paul sat in the dimly lit safe house, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The room was sparsely furnished, with just a bed, a small table, and a single chair. The isolation gave him plenty of time to think, to replay the events that had led him here. He missed Susan and Sarah desperately, but he knew this was the only way to keep them safe. As days turned into weeks, Paul kept in touch with Jake through a burner phone, receiving updates on Susan and Sarah's well-being. He was grateful for Jake's support, but the loneliness and constant fear of being discovered gnawed at him. He knew that living like this couldn't be a permanent solution. He had to make a decision, one that would protect his family and possibly put an end to the looming threat once and for all. One night, unable to sleep, Paul sat at the table and began to write. He poured his heart out onto the paper, detailing everything he had kept hidden for so long. The letter was meant for Susan, a full confession of his past, his regrets, and his enduring love for her and Sarah. He knew that if anything happened to him, she deserved to know the whole truth. Paul's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. His heart raced as he cautiously approached, peering through the peephole. It was Jake, his face tense and serious. Paul opened the door, and Jake stepped inside quickly, closing it behind him. "We have a problem," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. "Someone's been asking questions, getting too close. We need to move you again." Paul nodded, the familiar wave of anxiety washing over him. "All right, what do we do?" Jake explained the new plan, but Paul could see the exhaustion in his friend's eyes. They were running out of places to hide, and the net was closing in. Paul knew he couldn't keep putting Jake and his family at risk. He had to take a stand. "Jake, I can't keep running," Paul said, his voice firm. "I need to end this once and for all. I need to confront them." Jake looked at him, concern etched in his features. "Paul, you know what that means. It's dangerous. You might not make it out alive." "I know," Paul replied, his resolve unwavering. "But I can't keep living in the shadows. I can't keep putting you and my family in danger. This has to end." Jake sighed, recognizing the determination in Paul's eyes. "All right, if that's what you want, I'll help you. But we need to be smart about it." Together, they devised a plan to draw out the remaining members of the criminal organization. Paul would use his knowledge of their operations and contacts to set a trap, a final showdown that would either end in his freedom or his death. The night of the confrontation arrived, and Paul felt a strange sense of calm. He knew the risks, but he also knew that this was the only way to secure a future for Susan and Sarah. Jake had arranged everything, and Paul trusted him implicitly. As Paul waited in the agreed-upon location, a deserted warehouse, memories of his old life flooded back. He thought of Vincent, the mentor who had saved him, and of the promise he had made to leave that life behind. Now, he was about to face the very people he had once called allies, but this time as an adversary. The sound of footsteps echoed through the empty space, and Paul steeled himself. The men who entered were familiar faces, ghosts from his past. They sneered at him, mocking his attempts to escape his fate. "Mark," one of them said, his voice dripping with malice. "We always knew you couldn't stay hidden forever." Paul stood his ground, his eyes cold and determined. "I'm not Mark anymore, and this ends tonight." A tense standoff ensued, words exchanged like weapons, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. Paul knew that Jake was positioned nearby, ready to intervene if things went south. But in that moment, it was just him and the ghosts of his past. The confrontation escalated, and Paul found himself fighting not just for his life, but for the future he had built with Susan and Sarah. The battle was fierce, a whirlwind of violence and desperation. But Paul fought with a ferocity born of love and determination. In the end, as the dust settled and the echoes of the struggle faded, Paul stood victorious, his enemies defeated. He was bruised and battered, but alive. He knew that the fight was far from over, but he had taken the first step towards reclaiming his life. As he left the warehouse, the weight of his decision lifted slightly. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had confronted his past and survived, and now he could begin the journey towards a future free from shadows. Paul returned to the safe house, his body aching from the confrontation but his spirit slightly lifted by the small victory. He knew the battle wasn't over, but he had taken a significant step in dismantling the threats from his past. Now he had to face the most challenging task of all: telling Susan everything. He sat down at the small table in the safe house, the letter he had started earlier still lying there. Picking it up, he read through his words, feeling the weight of each confession. With a deep breath, he added the details of the recent confrontation, making sure Susan understood the risks he had taken to protect her and Sarah. That evening, with Jake's help, Paul arranged to meet Susan at a secure location. The tension was palpable as they embraced, holding each other tightly after weeks of separation. Susan's eyes were filled with a mix of relief and apprehension. "Paul, what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I had to confront them, Susan," Paul replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep putting you and Sarah in danger. But now you need to know everything." They sat down and Paul handed her the letter. Susan's hands shook slightly as she unfolded the paper and began to read. Paul watched her face closely, seeing the emotions play across her features. Shock, sadness, and a deep, painful understanding. When she finished reading, tears welled up in her eyes. "Paul, Mark, I don't know what to say." Paul reached out, taking her hands in his. "I'm sorry, Susan. I should have told you everything from the beginning. But I was scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of my past catching up with us. I thought I could protect you by keeping it hidden." Susan looked at him, her eyes searching his. "I understand why you did it, but it doesn't make it any easier. I need time to process all of this. But I still love you, Paul. And I believe you when you say you've changed." Paul felt a wave of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Susan. I promise no more secrets. From now on, we face everything together." Susan nodded, her grip on his hands tightening. Together. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions as Susan and Paul tried to rebuild their trust and find a way forward. They knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Paul's confrontation had bought them some time, but they needed a long-term plan to ensure their safety. With Jake's help, they started working on a new strategy. Jake used his connections to gather information on any remaining threats, while Paul and Susan made preparations for a potential relocation. It was a daunting task, but the renewed sense of partnership and honesty gave them strength. One evening, as they sat together planning their next steps, Sarah wandered into the room, her eyes sleepy. She climbed into Paul's lap, snuggling against him. "Daddy, are we going on an adventure?" she asked, her voice filled with innocent curiosity. Paul smiled, kissing her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going on a big adventure. But don't worry, Mommy and Daddy will always be with you." As Sarah drifted off to sleep, Paul and Susan shared a look of determination. They knew the road ahead would be challenging, but they were ready to face it together. The truth had been revealed, and now, with their love and trust stronger than ever, they could begin the journey towards a new future. Paul held Sarah close, feeling the warmth of her small body against his. He looked at Susan, who gave him a reassuring smile. They had come through the fire, and now it was time to rebuild their lives, piece by piece, with honesty and love as their foundation. As they prepared for the next chapter, Paul felt a renewed sense of hope. He had faced his past and survived, and now, with his family by his side, he was ready to embrace whatever the future held. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences of Paul's past actions were only beginning to unfold. As he and Susan navigated the complexities of their new reality, the strain on their relationship became evident. They both knew that rebuilding trust would be a long and difficult journey. One afternoon, Paul received a call from Jake with troubling news. Despite their efforts to cover their tracks, remnants of the old criminal organization were still searching for him. The confrontation had stirred up a hornet's nest, and now, they were more determined than ever to find Mark. "Susan," Paul said, his voice tense as he relayed the information. "We need to be even more careful. They're still looking for me." Susan's face paled, but she nodded resolutely. "We'll get through this, Paul. But we need to be smart about it. We need to think about what's best for Sarah." The next few days were spent in a whirlwind of activity. Jake helped them set up new identities and plan a potential move to a different city. It was a painful process, knowing they might have to leave behind the life they had built. but they were willing to do whatever it took to protect their daughter. One evening, as they sat in their living room, surrounded by packed boxes, Susan turned to Paul. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Paul nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "I know. It's not going to be easy, but we have to keep moving forward." Susan took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about everything you told me, about your past. It's hard to reconcile the man I know with the man you used to be. But I also see how much you've changed. I see how much you love us, and how far you're willing to go to protect us." Paul felt a lump in his throat as he listened. "I love you and Sarah more than anything. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe, even if it means leaving everything behind." Susan reached out, taking his hand. "I believe you, Paul, but I need you to understand something. Trust is something we'll have to rebuild, day by day. I'm willing to do that, but it's going to take time." Paul squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with determination. "I understand, Susan. I'm here for the long haul. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust again." As they sat there, holding hands amidst the chaos of their packed belongings, they both felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were in this together, and they were willing to fight for their family's future. The next morning, they began their journey to a new city, leaving behind the familiar streets and the home they had known. It was a bittersweet departure, but they knew it was necessary. With Jake's help, they had found a quiet town where they could start over, away from the prying eyes of those who sought to harm them. The transition was challenging. Susan found a new job, and Paul focused on rebuilding their lives from the ground up. Every day was a step towards healing, towards creating a safe and stable environment for Sarah. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their new home, watching Sarah play in the yard, Paul turned to Susan. "I know this isn't the life we planned, but I'm grateful we're together. I'm grateful for you." Susan smiled, her eyes reflecting a mix of sorrow and hope. "We're stronger together, Paul. We'll make this work, one day at a time." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over their new beginning, Paul felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time, he felt that they had a chance to build a life based on truth, love, and the unwavering determination to protect their family. And so, they faced the future hand in hand, ready to confront whatever came their way, because in the end, they knew that together, they could overcome anything. Paul's efforts to protect his family were about to be tested once more. Despite their move and new identities, remnants of the old criminal organization were still searching for him. Jake's warnings had become more urgent, and Paul knew that a final confrontation was inevitable. One evening, as Susan was putting Sarah to bed, Paul received a call from Jake. "They found out where you are, Paul. We don't have much time. You need to be ready." Paul's heart sank. He had hoped for more time, but now he had to act quickly. He hung up and went to Susan, his face grim. "It's happening. They're coming." Susan's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded resolutely. "What do we do?" Paul took a deep breath. "We need to get you and Sarah to safety. Jake and I will handle the rest." Susan hugged Sarah tightly, whispering reassurances in her ear as they prepared to leave. Paul watched them, his heart breaking at the thought of what might happen. He had to protect them no matter the cost. Jake arrived shortly after, his face set with determination. "There's a safe house nearby where Susan and Sarah can stay. We'll handle this." They drove to the safe house, the tension palpable. Paul kissed Susan and Sarah goodbye, his heart heavy with the weight of their safety. "Stay here, and don't open the door for anyone but Jake or me," he told Susan. "I love you," Susan said, tears in her eyes. "Come back to us." "I will," Paul promised, holding her gaze for a moment longer before turning to face the threat. Paul and Jake headed back to their home, preparing for the confrontation. They had set up the house to give them the upper hand, using every tactic and strategy they knew. As they waited, Paul felt a sense of calm wash over him. He was ready to face his past, to end this once and for all. The night was eerily quiet when the first car pulled up. Paul watched from the shadows, his heart pounding but his mind focused. The men who emerged from the car were familiar faces, ghosts from a life he had tried to leave behind. "Mark," one of them called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "We know you're here. Come out, and we can settle this." Paul stepped into the light, his eyes cold and determined. "I'm not Mark anymore, and this ends tonight." The confrontation was brutal and swift. Paul and Jake fought with everything they had, using their knowledge of the house to their advantage. It was a battle of wits and strength, each move calculated, each strike deliberate. In the midst of the chaos, Paul found himself face to face with the man who had once been his closest ally. "You betrayed us, Mark. You think you can just walk away?" "I did what I had to do," Paul replied, his voice steady. "And I'll do it again to protect my family." The fight reached its peak, and Paul felt a surge of determination. This was his moment, the chance to finally break free from the chains of his past. With a final, powerful move, he subdued his opponent, the threat finally neutralized. As the dust settled, Paul looked around at the aftermath of the battle. Jake was by his side, battered but alive. They had done it. The threat was over. Paul's thoughts immediately turned to Susan and Sarah. He and Jake quickly made their way back to the safe house. When Paul walked through the door, he was met with the sight of Susan holding Sarah close, their faces filled with relief. "Daddy!" Sarah cried, running into his arms. Paul held her tightly, tears streaming down his face. "It's over," he whispered. "We're safe now." Susan embraced him, the weight of their ordeal finally lifting. "Thank you, Paul. Thank you for everything." As they sat together, the reality of their new life began to sink in. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. Paul knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time he felt a sense of peace. They had confronted the past and won. Now they could truly begin to build a future free from fear. And as they looked forward to the days ahead, they knew that no matter what came their way, they would face it together, stronger and more united than ever before. The days that followed the final confrontation were filled with a sense of relief and cautious optimism. Paul, Susan, and Sarah began to settle into their new life, grateful for the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. They knew that the shadows of the past might still linger, but they were determined to move forward together. One crisp autumn morning, Paul woke up early and watched the sunrise from their porch. The sky was painted with hues of pink and orange, a symbol of a new beginning. He felt a sense of calm that he hadn't experienced in years. Susan joined him, a warm cup of coffee in her hands. They stood together, silently appreciating the beauty of the moment. "How are you feeling?" Susan asked, breaking the silence. "Better," Paul replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "For the first time in a long while, I feel like we can breathe again." Susan smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We've come a long way, Paul, and we did it together." Paul nodded, wrapping his arm around her. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my rock, Susan." They stood there for a while longer, savoring the tranquility of the morning. When Sarah woke up, she ran outside to join them, her laughter filling the air. Paul scooped her up, spinning her around as she giggled with delight. "Daddy, are we really safe now?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with innocence. Paul kissed her forehead, holding her close. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe, and we'll always protect you." As the days turned into weeks, the family settled into a routine. Paul found a job teaching literature at a local community college, and Susan continued her work as a journalist, using her skills to uncover stories that made a difference. They made new friends in the community, slowly building a network of trust and support. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Paul looked at his family, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I want to thank both of you for believing in me, for standing by me through everything." Susan reached across the table, taking his hand. "We believe in you because we love you, Paul. You've shown us what true strength and redemption look like." Sarah nodded enthusiastically, her eyes shining with admiration. "You're the best daddy ever." Paul's eyes filled with tears as he smiled at his daughter. And you're the best daughter I could ever hope for." As the family continued to heal, Paul and Susan made a promise to each other. They would always be honest, always support one another, and never let fear dictate their lives again. They knew that challenges would still come, but they were ready to face them together. One day, while walking through the park, Paul noticed a small group of students reading under a tree. He felt a pang of nostalgia, remembering his own love for literature and the way it had shaped his life. He approached them, curious about what they were reading. "Hi there," he said, smiling warmly. "What are you all reading?" The students looked up, their faces lighting up with excitement. "We're reading To Kill a Mockingbird," one of them replied. "It's for our literature class." Paul nodded, feeling a sense of pride. "That's a wonderful book. It teaches us so much about justice, empathy, and standing up for what's right." As he spoke with the students, Paul felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that despite everything he had been through, he still had so much to offer, so much to teach, and he was determined to use his experiences to make a positive impact on the world. Returning to Susan and Sarah, he felt a deep sense of contentment. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their love and resilience guiding them through the toughest times. And now, they were ready to embrace the future, one filled with hope, love, and endless possibilities. As they walked home together, hand in hand, Paul knew that they had truly found their new beginning. And with his family by his side, he was ready to face whatever the future held, confident that they could overcome anything as long as they were together.